All right, let's dive into this case you wanted to hear about, Andre Crawford.
Yeah.
This one, you sent over these sources, and I gotta say, they're,
Heavy stuff.
yeah, it's really disturbing stuff. This is Andre Crawford, a Chicago serial killer and active in the 90s.
Right.
And the thing that really got me right off the bat is this guy was involved in a police operation trying to help catch another serial killer while he was actively committing murders himself.
Yeah, that really speaks to a chilling level of compartmentalization, kind of a distorted reality that we sometimes see in serial killer profiles. I mean, it really begs the question, how could he possibly separate those two parts of his life so completely?
Yeah, it's almost like something out of a movie, like a psychological thriller.
It is.
But before we get to that whole twist, I think it's important to kind of lay the groundwork here. So let's talk about Crawford's background. His childhood was definitely rough, lots of challenges, foster care, there were allegations of abuse. He went into the military, but things didn't go well. Ended up with a dishonorable discharge. He was struggling with drug use at the time.
Uh,
And, he winds up in Chicago's red light district. He's living in pretty squalid conditions.
Right.
But here's the thing that I found really, really unsettling. You read accounts of people who knew him back then,
Hmm.
and they described him as friendly,
Yeah.
even helpful.
Right. Well, that really highlights the danger of surface impressions,
Yeah.
and I think that dissonance between his everyday persona and the brutal crimes he committed is something that often comes up in these cases.
Yeah.
It can be pretty jarring.
It's very disturbing, especially when you look at the timeline of his crimes.
Right.
In 1995, he was actually arrested for assault and rape. He spent a year in jail, but the charges were dropped because the victim wouldn't testify.
Yeah, and that's a tragically common barrier, particularly when victims are involved in sex work or struggling with addiction. The system, it often fails to offer them the support and protection they need to come forward.
Yeah. And in this case, you have to wonder if that lack of accountability in a way maybe emboldened Crawford.
That's possible.
So between 1993 and 1999, he killed 11 women, all in the Inglewood neighborhood of Chicago. His victims were all black women, many of them involved in prostitution or drugs. And, his MO was pretty consistent.
Right.
He'd lure them with promises of cocaine or money for sex, and then he'd strangle them or stab them, leaving their bodies in abandoned buildings or empty lots.
It's important to remember that Inglewood at that time was a community deeply affected by poverty and violence.
Right.
And that reality tragically made these women more vulnerable. It also, in a sense, provided Crawford with a grim kind of cover,
Right.
a sense of anonymity.
Yeah. And what's even more chilling, if you can believe it, is that another serial killer, Hubert Geralds, was operating in the same area during this period. Wait, hold on. Two serial killers
Yeah.
at the same time,
Wait.
preying on a similar population in the same neighborhood.
Yes.
It's
a nightmare scenario.
like a nightmare scenario if I've ever heard one. But didn't you say something about Gerald's falsely confessing to one of Crawford's murders?
Yes, that's right. In a really bizarre twist of fate, Crawford eventually confessed to killing Rhonda King, a murder that Gerald's had already been convicted of. And it was Crawford's confession, combined with DNA evidence, that ultimately led to Gerald's being exonerated for that particular crime.
Okay, so I have to admit, this is one of the things in the research that it's mind-blowing to me.
Mhm.
Crawford was literally helping the police try to catch a serial killer while he was out there committing murders himself.
I know.
It's almost, I can't even wrap my head around it.
It's hard to comprehend.
What could possibly be going through this guy's mind?
It's impossible to say for sure without a thorough psychological evaluation. But, one thing we often see in serial killers is a need for power and control. And participating in that manhunt while simultaneously evading capture, it's a chilling thought,
Mm-hmm.
but it could have fed that need. Imagine the audacity, the feeling of superiority he might have gotten from being steps ahead of law enforcement.
Yeah, it's a truly disturbing thought. So how did they finally catch him
Yeah.
if he was so good at hiding in plain sight?
Well, DNA technology, which was still relatively newer in the late 90s, that ended up being his undoing. They connected him to 7 of the murders through DNA evidence, and once he was arrested in January of 2000, Crawford, he readily confessed. He even admitted to additional killings and attacks that they hadn't yet linked to him.
Wow. And during those confessions, did he express any remorse, any sense of guilt for what he had done?
Not at all. His confessions were delivered with a chilling nonchalance. He even described his killing as an addiction, which, suggests a complete lack of empathy and a disturbingly detached perspective on his own actions. One of the things he said, according to the sources you provided, was that, he wouldn't have stopped killing if he hadn't been caught.
That's a bone-chilling thought.
Yeah.
Okay, so he's arrested, confesses to these horrific crimes, but his story doesn't end there, right?
Right.
There were those significant delays before his trial even began.
Yeah, this is where we see, the intricacies of the legal system coming into play. Because despite his confession, it took almost 10 years for Crawford's trial to begin. This delay was due to various legal hurdles, including a moratorium on the death penalty in Illinois at that time. And the result was that he spent an unprecedented amount of time in the Cook County Jail.
Wow.
Almost a decade awaiting trial.
That's a long time. And I can only imagine, how agonizing that wait must have been for the families of his victims.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. That extended wait for justice, for some sense of closure, that must have been incredibly difficult for them.
Right.
And of course, for Crawford himself, this period of confinement likely had a profound impact on his psychological state as well.
Okay, so finally, after all those years, the trial begins. What was the outcome?
Well, in December 2009, Crawford was found guilty of all charges, 11 counts of murder, as well as sexual assault and attempted murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. However, Crawford didn't die in prison of old age. He developed liver cancer and passed away in 2017, just 2 days before his 55th birthday.
So in a sense, he did evade the death penalty, even though it wasn't through legal means.
Right.
This entire story, it's full of shocking turns, the brutality of his crimes, his chilling lack of remorse, the fact that he was operating alongside another serial killer, the lengthy delay in justice being served. It's a lot to process, even for someone, who's pretty familiar with true crime.
It certainly challenges our understanding of human behavior, doesn't it?
It does.
It forces us to confront the reality that evil can exist even in the most mundane of settings. And it raises some really important questions about how we can, as a society, identify and prevent these kinds of tragedies from happening in the future.
Exactly. I mean, thinking about those 11 women, their lives cut short, their families left to grieve. It's a stark reminder that behind every headline, behind every statistic, there are real people whose lives have been shattered. But it also makes you wonder, what creates a monster like Crawford? Was it his traumatic childhood, the systemic failures he experienced, or was it something inherent within him?
Right.
And how can we prevent future tragedies like this?
Those are the questions that criminologists and psychologists are constantly wrestling with. It's not a simple equation, and there are rarely easy answers. But exploring those questions, trying to understand the complex interplay of individual psychology and societal factors, that's where I think we can start to find some hope, some path towards a safer future.
It's definitely complex and something we'll need to unpack further. But before we go there, I want to go back to that detail that really grabbed me from the beginning. Crawford's involvement in that police operation to catch another serial killer while he was actively killing. It's such a bizarre and disturbing detail.
It really highlights, the psychological complexities of these cases, this level of compartmentalization, of being able to function in seemingly normal ways while simultaneously engaging in horrific acts. It just suggests a profound disconnect from reality.
Yeah, like he was living this double life and a very dangerous one at that. Was it simply a power trip? A way to taunt the authorities? Or was there something more to it, some deeper psychological motivation at play?
It's impossible to know for sure without a comprehensive psychological profile, but it's possible that he derived this perverse sense of control from the situation.
Yeah.
Imagine the adrenaline rush, the feeling of being untouchable, of outsmarting everyone around him.
It's a chilling thought, and it adds another layer of complexity to an already incredibly disturbing case.
It certainly does, and it speaks to the often blurry lines between predator and prey, between hunter and hunted. This one detail, this bizarre twist of fate, it forces us to confront, this uncomfortable truth that the human mind is capable of both profound darkness and remarkable deception.
And it makes you wonder how many other cases like this are out there,
right,
waiting to be uncovered. How many predators are hiding in plain sight, masked by these seemingly ordinary lives?
Mm-hmm.
It's a terrifying thought, but one that we can't afford to ignore. Let's take a moment to absorb all of this. We've covered a lot of ground,
We have.
and it's heavy stuff. We'll be right back to delve deeper into the mind of Andre Crawford and explore what his case can teach us about the nature of evil, the complexities of the justice system, and ultimately our own vulnerability in a world where monsters can hide in plain sight.
Looking forward to it.
Okay, I think we need to go back to those victims for a moment. It's easy to get caught up in all the sort of macabre details of a serial killer case, but these were real women with lives, families, hopes, and dreams.
Absolutely. It's so essential to remember that behind the statistics, behind the headlines, there were 11 individual human beings who lost their lives, and their families, their loved ones, were left to grapple with the devastating consequences.
Yeah. And from what I understand, Crawford, he specifically targeted women who were already facing incredible hardships.
Yeah.
It's like he preyed on their vulnerability.
And that's a pattern we see in a lot of serial killer cases, a chilling manipulation of vulnerability.
Right.
He used, the promise of drugs or money, things they desperately needed to lure them into dangerous situations. It really speaks to the darkness at the heart of these crimes, the deliberate exploitation of those already struggling.
And tragically, that exploitation is sort of compounded by the fact that many of these women, because of their involvement in sex work or drug use, were already, distrustful of the police and the legal system.
Right. It creates a vicious cycle, doesn't it? Their circumstances made them more vulnerable to predators like Crawford, but those same circumstances also made it harder for them to seek help or justice. It's a heartbreaking reality, and one that I think underscores the need for greater compassion and understanding within our legal and social systems.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier that DNA evidence ultimately linked Crawford to the murders. But given that he had a prior arrest, why did it take so long to connect him to the crimes?
That's a great question, and it really gets to the heart of how forensic science was evolving in the 1990s. Back then, DNA technology was in its early stages, so the process of analyzing samples and comparing them to databases was much slower and more expensive than it is today.
So even though they had a DNA sample from Crawford on file from that previous arrest, they didn't routinely test it against unsolved crimes.
Exactly. It wasn't until they specifically tested his DNA against the evidence collected from the murders that they got a match.
Right.
And of course, his confession after his arrest further solidified the case against him.
It makes you think about how many other cases might be out there.
Oh, yeah.
Unsolved crimes that could be cracked with today's advanced DNA technology.
Well, absolutely.
It's both hopeful and unsettling at the same time.
It is. Forensic science is constantly advancing, and we're seeing remarkable progress in areas like DNA analysis, facial recognition, digital forensics. These advancements hold incredible promise for solving cold cases and bringing justice to victims and their families, even years or decades after the crimes occurred.
Yeah, it's like this race against time, isn't it?
Yeah.
Technology is constantly evolving, opening up these new possibilities for solving crimes.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, new crimes are being committed.
Mm-hmm.
And some perpetrators might believe they've gotten away with it.
That's a powerful way to put it. And it highlights, I think, the ongoing challenge, for law enforcement and forensic investigators, staying ahead of the curve, constantly adapting to new technologies and techniques to ensure justice is served.
Yeah. And speaking of justice, I have to ask about those significant delays in Crawford's trial. You mentioned it took almost 10 years for his case to go to court. What were the main reasons for those delays?
Well, there were several factors at play.
Yeah.
Firstly, there were numerous legal challenges, motions filed by both the defense and the prosecution. As is common in complex cases like this, it's a process of due diligence, ensuring that all legal avenues are explored. Then there was the moratorium on the death penalty in Illinois at the time, which created uncertainty and legal wrangling, particularly since capital punishment was being considered for Crawford. And lastly, there were some procedural errors that further complicated the process.
And I can only imagine the emotional toll that the delays must have taken on the families of the victims.
Yeah.
Having to wait so long for justice, reliving the trauma over and over again as the case just dragged on. It's just unimaginable.
Yeah. It speaks to the need for a justice system that's both thorough and efficient.
Right.
One that, balances the rights of the accused with the needs of the victims and their families.
And for Crawford himself, spending almost a decade in jail,
Yeah.
awaiting trial.
Yeah.
That must have had a profound impact on his psychological state as well.
You're right to point that out. Extended pretrial detention, especially, under the conditions in a place like Cook County Jail can be extremely challenging.
Mm.
It's difficult to assess the precise impact without knowing more about his specific experience, but it's certainly a factor to consider when examining his psychological profile.
Yeah, it makes you wonder, was there any like change in his behavior or his demeanor during those years leading up to the trial?
Unfortunately, the source material you provided doesn't delve into his behavior during that period. That kind of detail would often come from court transcripts or psychological evaluations, which weren't included in your sources.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
But it's certainly something to ponder. And then finally, after all those years, the trial takes place. He's found guilty, sentenced to life in prison, but ultimately dies from liver cancer while incarcerated.
It's almost like this final twist of fate that he didn't escape punishment, but also didn't face the death penalty that was initially considered.
Yeah, it's certainly a complex ending to a complex story.
Mm.
And while it may provide a sense of closure for some, I imagine it also leaves many questions unanswered.
Definitely. And, one of the questions that keeps coming back to me is this. Could the police have caught him sooner? They were aware of the murders happening in Inglewood, and Crawford was even helping them with the investigation at one point.
Right, that's a question that's often asked in these cases, and it's so difficult to answer definitively.
Hindsight is always 20/20, but back then they were dealing with a high crime area, multiple potential suspects, limited resources, plus, Crawford's outward persona, his ability to blend in and appear helpful, likely helped him evade suspicion for a while.
It's like he was playing this twisted game right under their noses.
It is. It's
Yeah.
a chilling thought, and it speaks to the cunning and manipulative nature that we often see in serial killers.
Right.
They often possess a keen understanding of social dynamics, which they use to their advantage.
And in this case, that manipulation was sort of compounded by societal biases and systemic failures.
Mm-hmm.
Inglewood at that time was a community struggling with poverty, crime, drug use, sense of hopelessness. It seems like Crawford wasn't just a monster who emerged out of thin air. He was a product of his environment, at least in part.
Yeah, and it's crucial to acknowledge the role of systemic factors, in shaping individuals and influencing their actions. While we can never excuse Crawford's crimes, we can't ignore the societal forces that contributed to his descent into darkness.
It's like that saying, hurt people hurt people.
Yeah.
It's not an excuse, but it's a reminder that violence often begets violence.
Right.
And Crawford, based on, his own traumatic childhood, he was a victim before he became a perpetrator. It's a tragic cycle and one that we need to break.
That's a powerful insight, and it highlights the need for early intervention and support systems for at-risk individuals.
Mm-hmm.
If we can identify and address the root causes of violence, we can hopefully prevent future tragedies like this.
It's a complex issue, but I think it's a conversation we need to have. We can't just lock up the monsters and pretend the problem is solved.
Right.
We need to look deeper, examine the societal structures that create these monsters in the first place.
Absolutely. It's about addressing the underlying causes, the systemic inequalities that create breeding grounds for violence. It's about investing in communities, providing opportunities, and breaking the cycle of trauma that so often leads to further suffering.
And it's about remembering that every individual, even someone like Crawford, is a product of their environment, their experiences, their choices. It's a reminder that the line between good and evil is often blurry, and that the potential for darkness exists within us all.
That's a profound and unsettling thought, but it's a truth that we can't afford to ignore.
And that brings us to, I think, a crucial question. What can we as individuals and as a society do to prevent future tragedies like this?
Yeah.
What lessons can we learn from the case of Andre Crawford?
Yeah.
And how can we apply those lessons to create a safer world?
Yeah, those are the questions that need to guide our actions, our policies, our approach to criminal justice and social welfare. We need to move beyond simply reacting to these horrors and start proactively addressing the root causes.
We need to shift our focus from punishment to prevention.
Exactly. And that requires a fundamental shift in how we think about crime, poverty, mental health, social responsibility. It requires a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths, to challenge ingrained biases, and to invest in long-term solutions rather than quick fixes.
It's a daunting task, But I think you're right. It has to start somewhere. We can't just throw up our hands and say there's nothing we can do.
And it's not just about large-scale societal change, it's also about individual actions. It's about being aware of our surroundings, speaking up when we see something wrong, and supporting those who are vulnerable.
It's about being active participants in creating a safer world.
Exactly. We all have a role to play.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the chilling world of Andre Crawford, I'm left with a mix of emotions. Horror at the brutality of his crimes, frustration at the systemic failures that allowed them to continue for so long, and a sense of responsibility to learn from this case and do everything we can to prevent future tragedies.
Yeah, I share those feelings. It's a heavy story, but an important one to tell. And I hope that by exploring it together, we've not only shed light on the darkness, but also ignited a spark of hope. A determination to make a difference.
Because ultimately, that's what it's all about, isn't it? Confronting the darkness, learning from it, and using that knowledge to create a brighter future. And to our listener, we leave you with this. Don't turn away from the hard questions. Engage with the complexities of this case. Reflect on the systemic issues it reveals, and consider what role you can play in building a safer, more compassionate world. Because even in the face of unimaginable horror, there's always hope. And that hope begins with each one of us.
That's a really good point. And it kind of leads me back to something we were talking about earlier, that whole thing about Crawford being involved in the police operation to catch another serial killer while he was out there doing it himself.
It's wild, right? That's the detail that I just keep coming back to. It's almost, I can't even fathom it. What kind of mental gymnastics had to be happening for him to be able to do that, to pull that off?
Yeah, I think it's a pretty chilling example of compartmentalization. That ability to kind of separate different aspects of your life, of your psyche, and we see this in a lot of cases of, extreme deception and criminal behavior.
But this is beyond just like leading a double life, right?
Yeah.
He wasn't just hiding his crimes. He was like inserting himself into the very process that was designed to catch someone like him.
Exactly. And it's possible, again, we're speculating here, but it's possible he derived this kind of twisted sense of power from that.
Right.
Like a feeling of superiority over the police. Maybe he enjoyed the risk, the challenge of staying one step ahead.
It's terrifying to think about, but it speaks to the insidious nature of these kinds of predators. They blend in, they manipulate, and sometimes they even participate in the systems that are meant to stop them.
Right. It's a stark reminder that evil doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes it hides in plain sight, disguised as normalcy.
And that brings us back to, I think, a question that we've been kind of circling around throughout this whole deep dive. What can we do?
Yeah.
How can we prevent future tragedies like this, knowing that these predators can be so adept at hiding their true nature?
It's a tough question.
It is.
And there's no easy answer, but I think it starts with awareness. Understanding the risk factors, the warning signs, the ways in which predators, they exploit vulnerabilities.
So being more vigilant, more tuned to those kind of subtle cues that something might be off.
Exactly. And it also means addressing, those systemic issues that create environments where predators, they can thrive. We talked about the challenges that the Inglewood community was facing in the 1990s. The poverty, lack of resources, that sense of hopelessness. Those factors, they create vulnerabilities that predators, they can exploit.
So it's not just about catching the bad guys after the fact. It's about addressing the root causes, the societal conditions that make these tragedies more likely to happen.
Precisely, yeah. It's about investing in communities, providing support for those at risk, fostering a culture of empathy and understanding.
It's a tall order,
Yeah.
but I think you're right. It has to start somewhere. We can't just throw up our hands and say, there's nothing we can do.
And it's not just about, large-scale societal change. It's also about individual actions. It's about, being aware of our surroundings, speaking up when we see something wrong, supporting those who are, vulnerable.
Being active participants in creating a lay-free world.
Exactly. Yeah, we all have a role to play.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the chilling world of Andre Crawford, I'm left with this mix of emotions, horror at the brutality of his crimes, frustration at the systemic failures that allowed them to continue for so long, and a sense of responsibility, I think, to learn from this case and do everything we can to prevent future
Yeah,
tragedies.
I share those feelings. It's a heavy story, but it's an important one to tell.
Mm.
And I hope that by exploring it together, we've not only shed light on the darkness, but also kind of ignited a spark of hope, a determination to make a difference.
Because ultimately, that's what it's all about, right? Confronting the darkness, learning from it, and using that knowledge to create a brighter future. And to our listener, we leave you with this. Don't turn away from the hard questions. Engage with the complexities of this case. Reflect on the systemic issues that it reveals. And consider what role you can play in building a safer, more compassionate world. Because even in the face of unimaginable horror, there is always hope, and that hope begins with each one of us.